The interior was cozy to Justin, but in reality, it was a room with cracked walls and old parquet on the floor. But to him, it felt cozy because it was warm. What was going on? Could it be fatigue after hard work? He got up and did some exercise, trying to warm himself up, but it did not help. Justin decided to drink hot tea, went to the table, and suddenly froze. He felt the touch of cold fingers on his back. It was the same dream come true. The cold was moving down his back, and it felt like someone was breathing down his neck. Justin screamed and jumped out into the hallway. He was barefoot, the old parquet painfully digging into his feet. "Mrs. Downey!" he shouted. "Where are you? Help!" There was silence in response. The house was so quiet that he could hear himself breathing. The house consisted of 7 rooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a toilet. Justin and the landlady occupied 2. The rest were empty. There were no other tenants. He strolled to the closet room and opened the door. Visually, it had been empty for decades, and there were cobwebs and a musty smell all around. He backed away in horror and felt the icy fingers on his back again. But now, they were getting closer and closer to his neck. Turning around was frightening, and Justin froze and squeezed his eyes shut. After standing like that for a few minutes, he turned around. There was no one behind him, and the touching had stopped. Despite the horror and fear, he had to keep going. Justin examined all the rooms. They all looked the same. No one could have lived there for years, and Mrs. Downey was nowhere to be found. Terrified, he ran to the front door, but it was gone. In place of the entrance was a blank, shabby wall. Fear mixed with panic. He wanted to scream his way out to the busy street where there was life. Justin went to the window, looked through it, and saw nothing. It was an early summer morning, with people strolling outside, ice cream vendors beckoning to customers, the sun shining, and the smell of freshly baked goods. But he was staring into nothing. Only gray, thick fog could be seen through the glass, and the cold was seeping through the window's cracks. Justin began to scream. He thought the scream would tear through this veil of incomprehensible terror, and everything would be as it had been before. There was no volume. It was as if his scream was muffled, and it was hard to breathe. He ran down the corridor to his room, leaving bloody footprints on his scarred old parquet flooring. Justin ran to his room and touched the doorknob. It was ice cold. He shuddered, cried, and felt the icy fingers on his back, more complex and comprehensive, as if those invisible cold hands wanted to wrap around his back like tentacles. Justin screamed hysterically and ran into his room. It was cold and gray, and it seemed as if the fog from the street was seeping in more and more, keeping out the sunlight and warmth. He did not know what to do, and his mind, racked with fear and terror, could not think straight. The creaking of the old wooden floorboards could be heard in the hallway. Justin cried. He knew something terrible was happening, and didn't know who he would see at the door. Mrs. Downey strolled into the room, placed a cup of something steaming in front of him, smiled, and slowly stroked her hand over his cheek. Her hand was icy. It was the same fingers he felt on his neck and back. "Drink," she said with an unnatural smile. Justin examined her. The landlady was pale, and her skin seemed gray. Mrs. Downey reeked of cold and smelled of a dead body. He did not want to drink, but could not resist. It seemed like someone else was controlling his hands and body. The drink was warming and tasteless, plunging Justin into a strange half-sleep state. He lay on the bed and stared at what was happening through closed eyes. His room was now lived in, but the furnishings looked as if they were from the past. The paintings, the furniture, and the beautiful and still new parquet looked great. The door opened, and Mrs. Downey entered the room again. She was rosy, attractive, and cheerful. Her bright silk dress fluttered with every step, and her pretty hair framed her pretty feminine face. A man walked into the room with her, invited her to sit in an armchair, and handed her a hot drink mug. Justin was creepy in the room, but he didn't seem to be noticed. He couldn't move or even open his eyes, just shaking and watching what was happening. Judging from his current landlady's interaction with the man, it was her husband, Mr. Downey. She looked at him with amorous eyes, drank the drink offered, and passed out. Justin wanted to scream, to ask her to wake up. He didn't understand what was happening. He tried to call for help, the police and doctors, but he couldn't. His destiny was immobility. Mr. Downey approached his wife's breathless body and felt her pulse and heartbeat. Mrs. Downey showed no signs of life. Her husband stood up from the chair, and her breathless body slumped and fell face down. He approached the lying spouse once more, smiled, and ran his fingers down her back. Justin felt the chilling touch again and lost touch with reality. He woke up after a while, his memory retaining everything he'd seen in the room. Justin jumped out of bed and opened his eyes. In front of him were the same shabby interior, the gray fog outside the window, and the ringing silence. But there was a mug on the table, the same one Mrs. Downey had given him. Justin strolled over to the table and examined the face. It was old, cracked, and dry. He could not have drunk a hot drink from it recently. Justin's exhausted mind couldn't cope with what was happening. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. His body was clammy with fear and trembling with cold. Mechanically, he picked up the locket that held the photo of his mother. "Goodbye, Mommy," he thought. Justin took the mug and strolled down the hallway, his other hand clutching the locket. Thoughts were almost non-existent. Animal fear and a feeling of utter hopelessness took over his mind completely. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind. Look for a door, a way out, any way out. It seemed to him to be his mother's voice. The old parquet creaked nastily under Justin's feet. There was silence again, the cold and gray fog slowly seeping through the walls. Justin approached the place where the front door was. On his back, he felt cold fingers that stroked his skin intensely and suddenly wrapped around his neck. Justin's breath caught, and he was getting cold. It felt like the cold was penetrating his bones and filling his insides. His body began to weaken, and his consciousness gradually shut down. With the last of his strength, he hit the wall where the front door used to be. Consciousness was returning to Justin. He felt the hospital's warmth and unfamiliar smell, and suddenly he heard his mother's native voice. Justin opened his eyes and saw his mother. She was honest, sitting beside his hospital bed and crying. He saw his mother and couldn't believe it was real and not a dream. Then the doctor came and told him that Justin had been missing for a year, and they had found him only today, lying in the street near the ruins of an old abandoned house. His brain resisted the information. How could it be? Since he had arrived 6 days ago for work and today was his legal day off. Justin was recovering. He wasn't disturbed by unnecessary questions, and his mother was always with him. Before he was discharged, she told him what she had learned from the police and people who lived near that unfortunate house. Many years ago, the Downey family lived there, husband and wife. Mrs. Downey was a good, kind woman, but her husband had cheated on her. Only his wife's wealth stopped him from divorcing her. So, one day, he decided to poison her by appropriating her fortune. Mrs. Downey died from the poison her husband put in her hot tea. He was arrested but could not be proven guilty. Mr. Downey lived almost a year on his wife's money and disappeared without a trace 6 days before her death. Exactly 1 year later, on the anniversary of Mrs. Downey's death, his corpse was found on the doorstep of their former family home. The cause of death could not be determined. After that, every year, some people strangely disappeared into the house. All of them disappeared 6 days before the anniversary of Mrs. Downey's death, but exactly 1 year later, they were found dead on the doorstep of that ill-fated house. Descendants of the Downey family's former neighbors said that those 6 days, the head of the family was preparing to murder his wife. It turned out that Justin was the only survivor of a string of dead people in that house. Justin woke up and opened his eyes. The warm, cozy room and the wood crackling in the fireplace were pleasant and peaceful. It was his home, where he had returned after his ill-fated trip to the city for work. It turned out that over the past year, some of the swamps had been drained and farming had begun to develop in his hometown. His mother built a big new fireplace, made repairs to the house, and hoped for the return of her disappearing son. Justin stayed with his mother and became a farmer. And recently he saw, in the press, that the strange house where people were disappearing and he almost died himself had been burned down.